Nobody's going to live through this. On Thursday, May 27th, 1943, Louis rose at 5 a.m. He pulled on his workout clothes, hiked to the runway, and began his morning mile run. 4 minutes and 12 seconds later, he finished. He It was a dazzling time, given that he was running in sand. He was in the best shape of his life. After breakfast, he climbed into a car with Phil and Cuppernell and headed for Honolulu for their day off. At the base gate, the despised lieutenant who oversaw their flights flagged them down. A B-24 piloted by a Tennessean named Clarence Corpening was missing, and they needed volunteers to hunt for it. Phil told him they had no plane. The lieutenant said they could take the Green Hornet. When Phil said the plane wasn't airworthy, the lieutenant disagreed, saying it had passed inspection. Phil knew that though the word volunteer was being used, this was an order. He volunteered. The lieutenant woke pilot Joe Deasy and recruited his crew as well. They'd take the B-24 Daisy May. Phil, Louis, Cuppernell turned back to round up their crew, stopping at his room. Louis opened his diary. There was only one ship, the Green Hornet, he wrote. We were very reluctant, but Phillips finally gave in for a rescue mission. Just before he left, Louis laid a note on his footlocker in which he kept his liquor hidden in mayonnaise jars. If we're not back in a week, it read, help yourself to the booze. Meeting the crews at Green Hornet, the lieutenant unrolled a map. He believed that Corpenig had gone down 200 miles north of Palmyra, an island several hours south of Hawaii. He assigned each crew to a search area, preparing for takeoff, everyone worried about Green Hornet. Without heavy bombs aboard, Louis told himself the plane should be able to stay airborne. Phil was concerned that mechanics had removed parts from the plane. He hoped nothing critical was missing. The crew reviewed crash procedures and checked survival equipment. There was a provisions box containing food, water, and survival supplies, the responsibility of the new tail gunner, Mac. Louis had made sure the extra life raft was there. He put on his Mae West. Phil left his off. At the last moment, a man ran up and asked for a ride to Palmyra. There had been no objections, and the man climbed aboard. Daisy May and the Green Hornet flew together toward Palmyra. Green Hornet couldn't keep up. After about 200 miles, Phil radioed to Deasy to go on ahead. The planes parted and the crews lost sight of each other. Mid-afternoon, Green Hornet reached its search area. Because of the clouds, no one could see the water. Phil dropped the plane under the clouds to just 800 feet. Louis stood just behind Phil and Cuppernell, scanning the ocean. Cuppernell asked if he could switch seats with Phil, taking over as a pilot. Phil agreed. The enormous Cuppernell squeezed around Phil into the left seat as Phil moved to the right. A few minutes later, there was a shudder. Louis looked out the window. Engine number 1 on the far left was shaking violently. Then it died. The bomber tipped left and began dropping rapidly toward the ocean. It was a dire emergency because Green Hornet was already very low. Phil and Cuppernell had only seconds to save the plane. They began working rapidly to minimize drag from the broken engine. They needed to feather it, turn the dead propeller blades parallel to the wind, and stop their rotation. Normally, this was Cuppernell's job, but now he was in the pilot's seat, busy trying to keep the plane airborne. He shouted to the new engineer to come feather the engine. The new engineer ran forward. There were 4 feathering buttons, one for each engine. Leaning between Cuppernell and Phil, the engineer banged on a button. Green Hornet heaved and lurched left. The engineer had hit the wrong button. Both leftward engines were now dead. Phil pushed the 2 working engines full on, trying to keep the plane up long enough to restart the good left engine. The racing right engines rolled the plane halfway onto its side, sending it into a spiral. The engine wouldn't start. The plane kept dropping. Green Hornet was doomed. Phil grunted 3 words, prepare to crash. Louis ran from the flight deck, yelling for everyone to get to crash positions. As the plane whirled, he grabbed the extra life raft, then clambered towards his crash position by the right waist window. He saw Mac clutching the provisions box. Other men were frantically pulling on Mae West's, but Mitchell didn't emerge from the noise. As the navigator, it was his duty to gather navigation and instruments for use on the life raft and relay the plane's position to the radio men so he could send a distress signal. But with the plane gyrating down nose first and the escape passenger narrow, perhaps Mitchell couldn't get out. As the men behind the cockpit fled the comparative safety of the rear, one man, almost certainly the engineer who'd hit the wrong feathering button, apparently stayed in front. It was his duty to pull the raft release handle behind the cockpit to ensure that the rafts would be near survivors. They would have to wait until an instant before the crash to pull the handle. This meant he'd have no chance to get to a crash position and thus little chance of survival. Phil and Cuppernill fought the plane. Green Hornet rolled onto its left side, moving faster and faster as the right engines thundered. Phil felt strangely fearless. He watched the ocean rotating up at him and thought, "There's nothing more I can do." Louis sat on the floor by the right waist window. There were 5 men near him. No one said anything. Louis looked out the window. All he saw was the cloud sky turning around and around. Sensing the ocean coming up at the plane, he took a last glance at the twisting sky, then pulled the life raft in front of him and pushed his head into the chest. One terrible and tumbling second passed, then another. An instant before the plane struck the water, Louis's mind throbbed with a single final thought: nobody's going to live through this. So this is really amazing how this started off as a search mission to help find some crew that were lost, apparently lost, had taken a plane and weren't able to return back to the base. And Louis and some of his crewmen were sent out to go look for these people individually. It sounds like it was sort of a failed mission from the get-go, but this is what starts the story of their survival in the ocean and eventually them being saved. So for Louis, there were jagged, soundless sensations. His body catapulted forward, the plane breaking open, something wrapping itself around him, the cold slap of water, and then its weight over him. Green Hornet stabbed into the ocean and blew apart. Louis felt himself being pulled deep underwater. Then abruptly, the downward motion stopped, and Louis was flung upward. The fuselage, momentarily buoyed by the air trapped inside, leapt to the surface. Louis opened his mouth and gasped. The air hissed from the plane, and the water rushed up over Louis again. The plane slipped under and sank toward the ocean floor. Louis tried to orient himself. The tail was no longer behind him, the wings no longer ahead. The men who'd been around him were gone. The impact had rammed Louis into a machine gun mount and wedged him under it face down. Countless wires were coiled around his body, binding him to the gun mount. He looked at them and thought spaghetti. He thrashed uselessly against them. He felt frantic to breathe. In the cockpit, Phil was fighting to get out. When the plane hit, he was thrown forward, his head striking something. A wall of water punched through the cockpit, and the plane carried him under. From the darkness, he knew he was far below the surface, sinking deeper by the second. He apparently saw Cuppernill squeeze his big body out of the plane. Phil found what he thought was the cockpit window frame, its glass missing. He pushed himself through and swam toward the surface. He emerged in a puzzle of debris, his head gushing blood. He found a hunk of wreckage and clung to it. It began to sink. There were 2 empty life rafts far away. Cuppernill was nowhere to be seen. Far below, Louis was writhing in the wires. He saw a body drifting passively. The plane coursed down, and the world fled away above. Darkness enfolded him, and the water pressure bore him with greater and greater intensity. He struggled helplessly. He thought, hopeless. He felt a sudden excruciating bolt of pain in his head. There was an oncoming stupor as he tore at the wires and clenched his throat against the need to breathe. With a soft realization that this was the last of his life, he passed out. He woke in total darkness. He thought, this is death. Then he felt the water still on him, the weight of the plane around him. Inexplicably, the wires were gone. He was floating inside the fuselage, which was bearing him downward. The air was gone from his lungs, and he was gulping reflexively, swallowing water. He tasted oil, fuel, and blood. He was drowning. Louis flung out his arms, trying to find a way out. His right hand struck something, and his college ring snagged onto it. His hand was caught. Then he reached toward it with his left hand and felt a smooth length of material. He was at the open right waist window. He put his feet on the frame and pushed off, wrenching his right hand free and cutting his finger and scraping his back on the fuselage. He kicked clear. The plane sank away. Louis yanked the inflation cords on his Mae West. He was suddenly light and the vest pulling him urgently upward. He burst into dazzling daylight. He gasped in a breath and immediately vomited up the salt water and fuel he'd swallowed. He had survived. That's the end of part 2 and the beginning of part 3. We will